Hello, everyone. This is John Hill. This is a presentation on the War of 1812, the Forgotten War. There's a lot of reasons why it's been called the Forgotten War, and we're going to talk about some of them, but the main reason, obviously, is because it hasn't been talked about too much. In the past 30 to 40 years, there's been quite a bit of publications and things like that about it, and various academic and scholarly reviews of it, but to that point, until about 40 years ago, no one was really talking about it. We're going to get into some reasons here why, but just to start off, maybe start thinking, why might a war be called the Forgotten War? It's not because of casualties. There was quite a few casualties in this war. It's not because of the battles. There was plenty of battles that were arguably significant on American soil. But yeah, let's get into it. So here's a map of the United States in 1803, so just before the War of 1812. As you see, the Louisiana Purchase and Indiana Territory obviously take up a big chunk of the map, but also there are the states and some disputed areas. You'll see up there on the far right-hand corner above New Hampshire, right above the Indiana Territory, where is now Wisconsin or Michigan, and then down underneath Mississippi under West Florida, which was actually against some Native Americans there trying to claim independence from the United States. So this is just a map to show you what was kind of going on right before the war. Obviously, it's a new country. It's only been around for about 50, 40 years at this point. So there's quite a bit of unclaimed or unmarked land here. And that makes the War of 1812 seem somewhat insignificant, just because of the amount of land mass that was being disputed over. Seemed almost kind of silly to many. And on top of that, much of the land was already claimed as territory of the USA after the War of Independence. So there's another reason why people may be against the War of 1812 at the time, because we already have this land. Why are we fighting over it again? War with the British obviously was still fresh in the Americans' minds at the time, because we had just gotten out of war with them, claiming independence from them. And when Congress said that we were going to war with them again, it was confusing to many Americans, as it probably should have been, because legally it says that we have those lands already, according to Congress and everyone like that. But it was partially just to drive out the forces that were still there, still occupying those territories. Another big part of the War of 1812 was many of the battles were naval. As you see here, there isn't any on the map shown here. There isn't any. As you see here, you don't see any other full countries. You just see various territories and things that actually weren't occupied by very many people from those countries, or possibly at all from those countries. So many of the battles were naval battles, because if they're coming from Europe, as France and Great Britain are, obviously they're going to travel by boat if it's the early 1800s, because it's going to be the fastest way to mobilize the troops. And much of the reasoning behind the start of War of 1812, also to that matter, was trade embargoing by the British on Americans after the War of American Independence. So let's get into that. To the point that much of the battles were naval. If you go back to primary sources and seek out accounts or pictures, paintings, things of that nature from the War of 1812, you'll see obviously naval battles. It was interesting for the USA to kind of undertake this, because the USA was horribly outnumbered by the British and the French in terms of naval power. And I think that there's theories that the U.S. was trying to test their military prowess, especially by sea, to as a new nation against a non in a non winners take all climate, as it would be with someone that you already claimed independence from 50 years ago. You would assume that they're not going to try to retake the whole country, but maybe try to keep try to hold onto the land that they still have in your country. So Congress kind of saw this, I believe, as a reasoning behind going into the War of 1812. The fact that many of the battles in the 1800s were naval battles, not just in the War of 1812, but generally, I think was a large driving factor. The Congress felt that we had a lot of unseasoned soldiers who are not familiar with fighting naval battles, and they felt that was a weakness in our defense. So, therefore, how do you get seasoned soldiers? You start a war, and that's kind of what brings us to the next slide here. Um, Many scholars think that the War of 1812 is partially a forgotten war because, like we've said a bunch, it's already against the same players that we've been fighting with for the past 50 years or so. And obviously, when you claim independence from someone, you expect um, all of the foreign forces to leave that soil, which you just claimed independence upon, in a war that you have won. Here we see that did not happen. That is one of the main reasons why many scholars do say that the War of 1812 is just a continuation of the War of Independence, because we were fighting against the British still. We still needed that last chunks of land that the British were occupying, and we had to fight for them. Some of the reasons why Congress didn't want to just solve it by peace treaties or diplomacy may have very well been linked to being a new nation and understanding that there is still quite a bit of animosity against the British inside of the newly established country. So possibly to get more backing behind the excessive use, or just the regular use, I guess you could say, since we were battling many different tribes at the time. Um, you may use the excuse of battling with an already common enemy instead of trying to make it seem like we're fighting an entirely new enemy, which is the Native Americans trying to claim independence on um, what was seen as U.S. soil at the time. Obviously, it was a different time back then, so a lot of race fear and you know racial tensions brought out warmongering and made the public scene maybe a little more susceptible to being okay with the war. Here is from a comic strip, actually, from the time. It's called a Scene on the Frontier, as practiced by the humane British and their worthy allies. So here it's kind of claiming that the British are paying for American scalps, to kind of create, or just really using the Indians against us on our own, on what was seen as our own soil. So this comic kind of is a primary source showing that um, we kind of did see the British as the main enemy and the Native Americans as kind of a secondary enemy, which is interesting because many of the battles that were fought in War of 1812 were actually against the Native Americans themselves, not necessarily any British involved at all. So it's an interesting way to show things because it's not showing us directly at war with the Indians. It kind of shows them as a secondary target, or being used by the British, and that's just an interesting point to me. Um, like I've said and theorized, officially the War of 1812 was about reclaiming territories from the French and the British, but many of the battles were with the Native Americans. Um, Tecumseh was a famous Native American. He tried to align the Shawnee people and create um, an independent nation within North America. Um, as we know now, that was not successful, um, and the American forces fought outright with Native Americans to claim that land from them. So this just kind of goes to show that distaste for Native Americans by the average citizen was um, a commonly held belief. So after knowing all that we know now about the War of 1812, um, here is a map showing the results of that. There's not much here compared to the one that I showed you earlier, which you may have already assumed or seen here. And this is one of the main reasons why, as previously stated, this is one of the main reasons why the War of 1812 is the Forgotten War. Many of the constituents at the time, as you can probably imagine, were very against the war. And for many Americans, this is one of the first showings against, other than the War of Independence, because there was many Americans that were against succeeding from the British. This is one of the first times that the public kind of went against Congress on the thoughts of a war or doing something. And definitely New England was probably the most upset, claiming that it was kind of a calamity of a war and they were only going to help for the acceleration of peace or the the ending of it, essentially, instead of contributing to it, which I thought was an interesting primary source there. So as a little bit of reflection, why would you support the war if you were a constituent at the time? Would you think, through all the reasons that we previously stated, many of them are theories, I would argue, and not necessarily said by Congress as reasoning as to why they were declaring war. They just kind of they just did it as they often do, and without explaining it. So I think the major driving factors behind why the citizens would support the war would be likely due to racism or against Indians, or possibly seeking revenge or further entanglements with the British, as a good thing. I mean, as what the citizens would see it as a time. Obviously, a much more different thinking than 2020, so it's kind of hard for us to grasp a citizens' reasoning back then as to why they would be in favor of it. But as I've also previously stated, it's clear that this was not a favorable war. Many of the constituents were against it. And when the constituents are against something, obviously they're not going to be in favor of it or tell tales of it or possibly even spread history of it, because it's not something they are invested in even remotely. So that is the main reason that I believe that the War of 1812 is a forgotten war, and it's because it was an unpopular war, because it kind of seemed like a redo against what we just did 50 years ago. And on top of that, it certainly had some racial, anti-indigenous people, not fun history to it, I guess is the best way to put it. It was not a glamorous war. There was 15,000 casualties, which is quite an amount for being a war fought entirely on U.S. soil. But I think the biggest takeaway is that, like I said, it wasn't a popular war, and it's going to be forgotten because of that. We'll analyze it, what is it now, 200 years in the future, as to what it was. But at the time, we just got out of that messy fight. We don't really want to talk about it anymore.